Headhunter by O. Henry. When the war between Spain and George Dewey was over, I went to the Philippine Islands. There I remained as bushwhacker correspondent for my paper until its managing editor notified me that an 800-word cablegram describing the grief of a pet carabao over the death of an infant Moro was not considered by the office to be war news. So I resigned and came home. On board the trading vessel that brought me back, I pondered much upon the strange things I had sensed in the weird archipelago of the yellow-brown people. The maneuvers and skirmishings of the petty war interested me not. I was spellbound by the outlandish and unreadable countenance of that race that had turned its expressionless gaze upon us out of an unguessable past. Particularly during my stay in Mindanao had I been fascinated and attracted by that delightfully original tribe of heathen known as the Headhunters. Those grim, flinty, relentless little men, never seen, but chilling the warmest noonday by the subtle terror of their concealed presence, paralleling the trail of their prey through unmapped forests, across perilous mountaintops, adown bottomless chasms, into uninhabitable jungles, always near with the invisible hand of death uplifted, betraying their pursuit only by such signs as a beast or a bird or a gliding serpent might make a twig crackling in the awful, sweat-soaked night, a drench of dew showering from the screening foliage of a giant tree, a whisper at even from the rushes of a water level, a hint of death for every mile and every hour. They amused me greatly, those little fellows of one idea. When you think of it, their method is beautifully and almost hilariously effective and simple. You have your hut in which you live and carry out the destiny that was decreed for you. Spiked to the jamb of your bamboo doorway is a basket made of green withes, plated, from time to time, as vanity or ennui or love or jealousy or ambition may move you. You creep forth with your snickersnay and take up the silent trail. Back from it you come, triumphant, bearing the severed, gory head of your victim, which you deposit with pardonable pride in the basket at the side of your door. It may be the head of your enemy, your friend, or a stranger, according as competition, jealousy, or simple sportiveness has been your incentive to labor. In any case, your reward is certain. The village men, in passing, stop to congratulate you, as your neighbor on weaker planes of life stops to admire and praise the begonias in your front yard. Your particular brown maid lingers, with fluttering bosom, casting soft tiger's eyes at the evidence of your love for her. You chew betel nut and listen, content, to the intermittent soft drip from the ends of the severed neck arteries. And you show your teeth and grunt like a water buffalo, which is as near as you can come to laughing. The thought that the cold, acephalous body of your door ornament is being spotted by wheeling vultures in the Mindanaoan wilds. Truly, the life of the merry headhunter captivated me. He had reduced art and philosophy to a simple code. To take your adversary's head, to basket it at the portal of your castle, to see it lying there, a dead thing, with its cunning and stratagems and power gone. Is there a better way to foil his plots, to refute his arguments, to establish your superiority over his skill and wisdom? The ship that brought me home was captained by an erratic Swede, who changed his course and deposited me, with genuine compassion, in a small town on the Pacific coast of one of the Central American republics, a few hundred miles south of the port to which he had engaged to convey me. But I was wearied of movement and exotic fancies. So I leaped contentedly upon the firm sands of the village of Mojada, telling myself I should be sure to find there the rest that I craved. After all, far better to linger there, I thought, lulled by the sedative plash of the waves and the rustling of palm fronds, than to sit upon the horsehair sofa of my parental home in the East, and there, cast down by current wine and cake, and scourged by fatuous relatives, drivel into the ears of gaping neighbors sad stories of the death of colonial governors. When I first saw Chloe Green, she was standing, all in white, in the doorway of her father's tile-roofed daub house. She was polishing a silver cup with a cloth, and she looked like a pearl laid against black velvet. She turned on me a flatteringly protracted but a wiltingly disapproving gaze, and then went inside, humming a light song to indicate the value she placed upon my existence. Small wonder, for Dr. Stanford, the most disreputable professional man between Juneau and Valparaiso, and I were zigzagging along the turfy street, tunelessly singing the words of Auld Lang Syne to the air of Muzzer's Little Coal Black Coon. We had come from the ice factory, which was Majada's palace of wickedness, where we had been playing billiards and opening black bottles, white with frost, that we dragged with strings out of old Sandoval's ice-cold vats. I turned in sudden rage to Dr. Stamford, as sober as the verger of a cathedral. In a moment I had become aware that we were swine cast before a pearl. "You beast," I said, "this is half your doing, and the other half is the fault of this cursed country. I'd better have gone back to Sleepy Town and died in a wild orgy of currant wine and buns than to have had this happen." Stamford filled the empty street with his roaring laughter. "You too," he cried, "and all as quick as the popping of a cork. Well, she does seem to strike agreeably upon the retina. But don't burn your fingers. All Majada will tell you that Louis Devoe is the man." "We will see about that," said I, "and perhaps whether he is a man as well as the man." I lost no time in meeting Louis Devoe. That was easily accomplished, for the foreign colony in Majada numbered scarce a dozen, and they gathered daily at a half-decent hotel kept by a Turk, where they managed to patch together the fluttering rags of country and civilization that were left them. I sought Devoe before I did my pearl of the doorway, because I had learned a little of the game of war, and knew better than to strike for a prize before testing the strength of the enemy. A sort of cold dismay, something akin to fear, filled me when I had estimated him. I found a man so perfectly poised, so charming, so deeply learned in the world's rituals, so full of tact, courtesy, and hospitality, so endowed with grace and ease and a kind of careless, haughty power that I almost overstepped the bounds in probing him, in turning him on the spit to find the weak point that I so craved for him to have. But I left him whole. I had to make bitter acknowledgment to myself that Louis Devoe was a gentleman worthy of my best blows, and I swore to give him them. He was a great merchant of the country, a wealthy importer and exporter. All day he sat in a fastidiously appointed office, surrounded by works of art and evidences of his high culture, directing through glass doors and windows the affairs of his house. In person he was slender and hardly tall. His small, well-shaped head was covered with thick, brown hair, trimmed short, and he wore a thick, brown beard also cut close into a fine point. His manners were a pattern. Before long I had become a regular and a welcome visitor at the Green home. I shook my wild habits from me like a worn-out cloak. I trained for the conflict with the care of a prize fighter and the self-denial of a Brahmin. As for Chloe Green, I shall weary you with no sonnets to her eyebrow. She was a splendidly feminine girl, as wholesome as a November pippin, and no more mysterious than a window pane. She had whimsical little theories that she had deduced from life, and that fitted the maxims of Epictetus like princess gowns. I wonder, after all, if that old duffer wasn't rather wise. Chloe had a father, the Reverend Homer Green, and an intermittent mother, who sometimes palely presided over a twilight teapot. The Reverend Homer was a burr-like man with a life work. He was writing a concordance to the scriptures, and had arrived as far as King's, being, presumably, a suitor for his daughter's hand. I was timber for his literary outpourings. I had the family tree of Israel drilled into my head until I used to cry aloud in my sleep, and Aminadab begot Jic, and so forth, until he had tackled another book. I once made a calculation that the Reverend Homer's concordance would be worked up as far as the 7 vials mentioned in Revelations about the 3rd day after they were opened. Louis Devoe, as well as I, was a visitor and an intimate friend of the Greens. It was there I met him the oftenest, and a more agreeable man or a more accomplished I have never hated in my life. Luckily or unfortunately, I came to be accepted as a boy. My appearance was youthful, and I suppose I had that pleading and homeless air that always draws the motherliness that is in women and the cursed theories and hobbies of paterfamiliases. Chloe called me Tommy, and made sisterly fun of my attempts to woo her. With Devoe she was vastly more reserved. He was the man of romance, one to stir her imagination and deepest feelings had her fancy leaned toward him. I was closer to her, but standing in no glamour. I had the task before me of winning her in what seems to me the American way of fighting with cleanness and pluck and everyday devotion to break away the barriers of friendship that divided us, and to take her, if I could, between sunrise and dark, abetted by neither moonlight nor music nor foreign wiles. Chloe gave no sign of bestowing her blithe affections upon either of us. But one day she let out to me an inkling of what she preferred in a man. It was tremendously interesting to me, but not illuminating as to its application. I had been tormenting her for the dozenth time with the statement and catalogue of my sentiments toward her. "Tommy," said she, "I don't want a man to show his love for me by leading an army against another country and blowing people off the earth with cannons." "If you mean that the opposite way," I answered, "as they say women do, I'll see what I can do. The papers are full of this diplomatic row in Russia. My people know some big people in Washington who are right next to the army people, and I could get an artillery commission and—" "I'm not that way," interrupted Chloe. "I mean what I say. It isn't the big things that are done in the world, Tommy, that count with a woman. When the knights were riding abroad in their armor to slay dragons, many a stay-at-home page won a lonesome lady's hand by being on the spot to pick up her glove and be quick with her cloak when the wind blew. The man I am to like best, whoever he shall be, must show his love in little ways. He must never forget, after hearing it once, that I do not like to have anyone walk at my left side, that I detest bright-colored neckties, that I prefer to sit with my back to a light, that I like candied violets, that I must not be talked to when I am looking at the moonlight shining on water, and that I very, very often long for dates stuffed with English walnuts." "Frivolity," I said with a frown. "Any well-trained servant would be equal to such details." "And he must remember," went on Chloe, "to remind me of what I want when I do not know, myself, what I want." "You're rising in the scale," I said. "What you seem to need is a first-class clairvoyant. And if I say that I am dying to hear a Beethoven sonata and stamp my foot when I say it, he must know by that what my soul craves is salted almonds, and he will have them ready in his pocket." "Now," said I am at a loss. I do not know whether your soul's affinity is to be an impresario or a fancy grocer." Joel turned her pearly smile upon me. "Take less than half of what I said as a jest," she went on, "and don't think too lightly of the little things, boy. Be a paladin if you must, but don't let it show on you. Most women are only very big children, and most men are only very little ones. Please us, don't try to overpower us. When we want a hero, we can make one out of even a plain grocer the third time he catches our handkerchief before it falls to the ground." That evening I was taken down with pernicious fever. That is a kind of coast fever with improvements and high gear detachments. Your temperature goes up among the 3s and 4s and remains there, laughing scornfully and feverishly at the cinchona trees and the coal, tar derivatives. Pernicious fever is a case for a simple mathematician instead of a doctor. It is merely this formula. Vitality plus the desire to live the duration of the fever the result. I took to my bed in the 2-roomed thatched hut where I had been comfortably established and sent for a gallon of rum. That was not for myself. Drunk, Stanford was the best doctor between the Andes and the Pacific. He came, sat at my bedside, and drank himself into condition. "My boy," said he, "my lily-white and reformed Romeo, medicine will do you no good, but I will give you quinine, which, being bitter, will arouse in you hatred and anger, 2 stimulants that will add 10% to your chances. You are as strong as a caribou calf, and you will get well if the fever doesn't get in a knockout blow when you're off your guard." For 2 weeks I lay on my back feeling like a Hindu widow on a burning ghat. Old Itasca, an untrained Indian nurse, sat near the door like a petrified statue of what's the use, attending to her duties, which were, mainly, to see that time went by without slipping a cog. Sometimes I would fancy myself back in the Philippines, or, at worst times, sliding off the horsehair sofa in Sleepy Town. One afternoon I ordered Itasca to Vamos, and got up and dressed carefully. I took my temperature, which I was pleased to find 104. I paid almost dainty attention to my dress, choosing solicitously a necktie of a dull and subdued hue. The mirror showed that I was looking little the worse from my illness. The fever gave brightness to my eyes and color to my face. And while I looked at my reflection, my color went and came again as I thought of Chloe Green and the millions of eons that had passed since I'd seen her, and of Louis Devoe and the time he had gained on me. I went straight to her house. I seemed to float rather than walk. I hardly felt the ground under my feet. I thought pernicious fever must be a great boon to make one feel so strong. I found Chloe and Louis Deveau sitting under the awning in front of the house. She jumped up and met me with a double handshake. "I'm glad to see you out again," she cried, every word a pearl strung on the string of her sentence. "You are well, Tommy, or better, of course. I wanted to come to see you, but they wouldn't let me." "Oh yes," said I, carelessly. "It was nothing, merely a little fever. I am out again, as you see." We three sat there and talked for half an hour or so. Then Chloe looked out yearningly and almost piteously across the ocean. I could see in her sea-blue eyes some deep and intense desire. Deveau, curse him, saw it too. "What is it?" we asked in unison. "Coconut pudding," said Chloe, pathetically. "I've wanted some so badly, for 2 days. It's got beyond a wish. It's an obsession." "The coconut season is over," said Deveau, in that voice of his that gave thrilling interest to his most commonplace words. "I hardly think one could be found in Mojada. The natives never use them except when they are green and the milk is fresh. They sell all the ripe ones to the fruiterers." "Wouldn't a broiled lobster or a Welsh rabbit do as well?" I remarked, with the engaging idiocy of a pernicious fever convalescent. Chloe came as near to pouting as a sweet disposition and a perfect profile would allow her to come. The Reverend Homer poked his ermine-lined face through the doorway and added a concordance to the conversation. "Sometimes," said he, "old Campos keeps the dried nuts in his little store on the hill. But it would be far better, my daughter, to restrain unusual desires and partake thankfully of the daily dishes that the Lord has set before us." "Stuff," said I. "How is that?" asked the Reverend Homer, sharply. "I say it's tough," said I, "to drop into the vernacular, that Miss Green should be deprived of the food she desires. A simple thing like calcimine. Perhaps," I continued solicitously, "some pickled walnuts or a fricassee of Hungarian butternuts would do as well." Everyone looked at me with a slight exhibition of curiosity. Louis Deveau arose and made his adieus. I watched him until he had sauntered slowly and grandiosely to the corner, around which he turned to reach his great warehouse and store. Chloe made her excuses and went inside for a few minutes to attend to some detail affecting the 7 o'clock dinner. She was a past mistress in housekeeping. I had tasted her puddings and bread with beatitude. When all had gone, I turned casually and saw a basket made of plated green withes hanging by a nail outside the door jamb. With a rush that made my hot temples throb, there came vividly to my mind recollections of the headhunters, those grim, flinty, relentless little men, never seen, but chilling the warmest noonday by the subtle terror of their concealed presence. From time to time, as vanity or ennui or love or jealousy or ambition may move him, one creeps forth with his snickers neigh and takes up the silent trail. Back he comes, triumphant, bearing the severed, gory head of his victim. His particular brown or white maid lingers, with fluttering bosom, casting soft tiger's eyes at the evidence of his love for her. I stole softly from the house and returned to my hut. From its supporting nails in the wall, I took a machete as heavy as a butcher's cleaver and sharper than a safety razor. And then I chuckled softly to myself and set out to the fastidiously appointed private office of Monsieur Louis Deveau, usurper to the hand of the Pearl of the Pacific. He was never slow at thinking. He gave one look at my face and another at the weapon in my hand as I entered his door, and then he seemed to fade from my sight. I ran to the back door, kicked it open, and saw him running like a deer up the road toward the wood that began 200 yards away. I was after him with a shout. I remember hearing children and women screaming and seeing them flying from the road. He was fleet, but I was stronger. A mile, and I had almost come up with him. He doubled cunningly and dashed into a break that extended into a small cannon. I crashed through this after him, and in 5 minutes had him cornered in an angle of insurmountable cliffs. There his instinct of self-preservation steadied him, as it will steady even animals at bay. He turned to me, quite calm, with a ghastly smile. "Oh, Rayburn," he said, with such an awful effort at ease that I was impolite enough to laugh rudely in his face. "Oh, Rayburn," said he, "come, let's have done with this nonsense. Of course, I know it's the fever and you're not yourself. But collect yourself. Man, give me that ridiculous weapon, now, and let's go back and talk it over. I will go back, said I, carrying your head with me. We will see how charmingly it can discourse when it lies in the basket at her door. Come, said he, persuasively. I think better of you than to suppose that you try this sort of thing as a joke. But even the vagaries of a fever-crazed lunatic come some time to a limit. What is this talk about heads and baskets? Get yourself together and throw away that absurd cane chopper. What would Miss Green think of you? He ended, with the silky cajolery that one would use toward a fretful child. Listen, said I. At last you have struck upon the right note. What would she think of me? Listen, I repeated. There are women, I said, who look upon horsehair sofas and currant wine as dross. To them, even the calculated modulation of your well-trimmed talk sounds like the dropping of rotten plums from a tree in the night. They are the maidens who walk back and forth in the villages, scorning the emptiness of the baskets at the doors of the young men who would win them. One such as they, I said, is waiting. Only a fool would try to win a woman by drooling like a braggart in her doorway or by waiting upon her whims like a footman. They are all daughters of Herodias, and to gain their hearts one must lay the heads of his enemies before them with his own hands. Now, bend your neck, Louis Devoe. Do not be a coward as well as a chatterer at a lady's tea table. There, said Devoe, falteringly. You know me, don't you, Rayburn? Oh yes, I said, I know you. But the basket is empty. The old men of the village and the young men, and both the dark maidens and the ones who are as fair as pearls walk back and forth and see its emptiness. Will you kneel now, or must we have a scuffle? It is not like you to make things go roughly and with bad form, but the basket is waiting for your head. With that he went to pieces. I had to catch him as he tried to scamper past me like a scared rabbit. I stretched him out and got a foot on his chest, but he squirmed like a worm, although I appealed repeatedly to his sense of propriety and the duty he owed to himself as a gentleman not to make a row. But at last he gave me the chance, and I swung the machete. It was not hard work. He flopped like a chicken during the 6 or 7 blows that it took to sever his head, but finally he lay still, and I tied his head in my handkerchief. The eyes opened and shut thrice while I walked 100 yards. I was red to my feet with the drip, but what did that matter? With delight I felt under my hands the crisp touch of his short, thick, brown hair and close-trimmed beard. I reached the House of the Greens and dumped the head of Louis Devoe into the basket that still hung by the nail in the door jamb. I sat in a chair under the awning and waited. The sun was within 2 hours of setting. Chloe came out and looked surprised. "Where have you been, Tommy?" she asked. "You were gone when I came out." "Look in the basket," I said, rising to my feet. She looked and gave a little scream of delight. I was pleased to note. "Oh, Tommy," she said, "it was just what I wanted you to do. It's leaking a little, but that doesn't matter. Wasn't I telling you? It's the little things that count. And you remembered. Little things." She held the ensanguined head of Louis Devoe in her white apron. Tiny streams of red widened on her apron and dripped upon the floor. Her face was bright and tender. Little things, indeed. I thought again. The headhunters are right. These are the things that women like you to do for them. Chloe came close to me. There was no one in sight. She looked tip at me with sea-blue eyes that said things they had never said before. "You think of me," she said. "You are the man I was describing. You think of the little things, and they are what make the world worth living in. The man for me must consider my little wishes, and make me happy in small ways. He must bring me little red peaches in December if I wish for them, and then I will love him till June. I will have no knight in armor slaying his rival or killing dragons for me. You please me very well, Tommy." I stooped and kissed her. Then a moisture broke out on my forehead, and I began to feel weak. I saw the red stains vanish from Chloe's apron, and the head of Louis Devoe turned to a brown, dried coconut. "There will be coconut pudding for dinner, Tommy boy," said Chloe gaily, "and you must come. I must go in for a little while." She vanished in a delightful flutter. Dr. Stamford tramped up hurriedly. He seized my pulse as though it were his own property that I had escaped with. You are the biggest fool outside of any asylum, he said, angrily. Why did you leave your bed? And the idiotic things you've been doing. And no wonder, with your pulse going like a sledgehammer. Name some of them, said I. DeVoe sent for me, said Stamford. He saw you from his window go to old Campo's store, chase him up the hill with his own yardstick, and then come back and make off with his biggest coconut. It's the little things that count, after all, said I. It's your little bed that counts with you just now, said the doctor. You come with me at once, or I'll throw up the case. You're as loony as a loon. So I got no coconut pudding that evening, but I conceived a distrust as to the value of the method of the headhunters. Perhaps for many centuries the maidens of the villages may have been looking wistfully at the heads in the baskets at the doorways, longing for other and lesser trophies. The Harbinger, by O. Henry. Long before the springtide is felt in the dull bosom of the yokel, does the city man know that the green goddess is upon her throne. He sits at his breakfast eggs and toast, begirt by stone walls, opens his morning paper and sees journalism leave Vernal. Ism at the post. 4. Whereas, spring's couriers were once the denke of our finer senses, now the Associated Press does the trick. The warble of the first robin in Hackensack, the stirring of the maple sap in Bennington, the ding of the pussy willows along Main Street in Syracuse, the first chirp of the bluebird, the swan song of the Blue Point, the annual tornado in St. Louis, the plaint of the peach pessimist from Pompton, NJ, the regular visit of the tame wild goose with a broken leg to the pond near Bilgewater Junction, the base attempt of the drug trust to boost the price of quinine foiled in the house by Congressman Jinks, the first tall poplar struck by lightning, and the usual stunned picnickers who had taken refuge, the first crack of the ice jam in the Allegheny River, the finding of a violet in its mossy bed by the correspondent at Round Corners. These are the advanced signs of the burgeoning season that are wired into the wise city, while the farmer sees nothing but winter upon his dreary fields. But these be mere externals. The true harbinger is the heart. When Strephon seeks his Chloe and Mike his Maggie, then only is spring arrived and the newspaper report of the 5-foot rattler killed in Squire Pettigrew's pasture confirmed. Ere the first violet blew, Mr. Peters, Mr. Ragsdale, and Mr. Kidd sat together on a bench in Union Square and conspired. Mr. Peters was the dartag, Nan of the loafers there. He was the dingiest, the laziest, the sorriest brown blot against the greenback ground of any bench in the park. But just then he was the most important of the trio. Mr. Peters had a wife. This had not heretofore affected his standing with Ragsy and Kidd, but today it invested him with a peculiar interest. His friends, having escaped matrimony, had shown a disposition to deride Mr. Peters for his venture on that troubled sea. But at last they had been forced to acknowledge that either he had been gifted with a large foresight, or that he was one of fortune's lucky sons. 4. Mrs. Peters had $1. A whole dollar bill, good and receivable by the government for customs, taxes, and all public dues. How to get possession of that dollar was the question up for discussion by the 3 musty musketeers. How do you know it was $1? Asked Ragsy, the immensity of the sum inclining him to skepticism. The Coleman's seen her have it, said Mr. Peters. She went out and done some washing yesterday. And look what she give me for breakfast, the heel of a loaf and a cup of coffee, and her with $1. It's fierce, said Ragsy. Say we go up and punch her and stick a towel in her mouth and cop the coin, suggested Kidd, viciously. Why ain't afraid of a woman, are you? She might holler and have us pinched, demurred Ragsy. I don't believe in slugging no woman in a house full of people. Gentlemen, said Mr. Peters, severely, through his russet stubble, remember that you are speaking of my wife. A man who would lift his hand to a lady except in the way of— Maguire, said Ragsy pointedly, has got his Bock beer sign out. If we had $1 we could— Hush up, said Mr. Peters, licking his lips. We got to get that case note somehow, boys. Ain't what's a man's wife's his? Leave it to me. I'll go over to the house and get it. Wait here for me. I've seen him give up quick, and tell you where it's hid if you kick him in the ribs, said Kidd. No man would kick a woman, said Peters virtuously. A little choking, just a touch on the windpipe, that gets away with him, and no marks left. Wait for me. I'll bring back that dollar, boys. High up in a tenement house between 2nd Ave, New and the river lived the Peterses in a back room, so gloomy that the landlord blushed to take the rent for it. Mrs. Peters worked at sundry times, doing odd jobs of scrubbing and washing. Mr. Peters had a pure, unbroken record of 5 years without having earned a penny, and yet they clung together, shar on each other's hatred and misery, being creatures of habit. Of habit, the power that keeps the earth from flying to pieces, though there is some silly theory of gravitation. Mrs. Peters reposed her 200 pounds on the safer of the 2 chairs and gazed stolidly out the one window at the brick wall opposite. Her eyes were red and damp. The furniture could have been carried away on a pushcart, but no pushcart man would have removed it as a gift. The door opened to admit Mr. Peters. His fox terrier eyes expressed a wish. His wife's diagnosis located correctly the seat of it, but misreaded hunger instead of thirst. "You'll get nothing more to eat till night," she said, looking out of the window again. "Take your hound dog's face out of the room." Mr. Peters's I calculated the distance between them. By taking her by surprise it might be possible to spring upon her, overthrow her, and apply the throttling tactics of which he had boasted to his waiting comrades. True, it had been only a boast. Never yet had he dared to lay violent bands upon her. But with the thoughts of the delicious, cool Bach or Kulmbacher bracing his nerves, he was near to upsetting his own theories of the treatment due by a gentleman to a lady. But, with his loafer's love for the more artistic and less strenuous way, he chose diplomacy first, the high card in the game, the as-summed attitude of success already attained. "You have $1, he said, loftily, but significantly in the tone that goes with the lighting of a cigar, when the properties are at hand. "I have," said Mrs. Peters, producing the bill from her bosom and crackling it, teasingly. "I am offered a position in a tea store," said Mr. Peters. "I am to begin work tomorrow, but it will be necessary for me to buy a pair of—" "You are a liar," said Mrs. Peters, reinterring the note. "No tea store, nor no ABC store, nor no junk shop would have you. I rubbed the skin off both me hands washin' jumpers and overalls to make that $1. Do you think it come out of them suds to buy the kind you put into you? Skidoo. Get your mind off of money." Evidently the poses of Talleyrand were not worth 100 cents on that $1. But diplomacy is dexterous. The artistic temperament of Mr. Peters lifted him by the straps of his Congress gaiters and set him on new ground. He called up a look of desperate melancholy to his eyes. "Clara," he said, hollowly, "to struggle further is useless. You have always misunderstood me. Heaven knows I have striven with all my might to keep my head above the waves of misfortune, but cut out the rainbow of hope and that stuff about walkin' one by one through the narrow aisles of Spain," said Mrs. Peters, with a sigh. "I've heard it so often. There's an ounce bottle of carbolic on the shelf behind the empty coffee can. Drink hearty." Mr. Peters reflected. What next? The old expedients had failed. The 2 musty musketeers were awaiting him hard by the ruined chateau, that is to say, on a park bench with rickety cast-iron legs. His honor was at stake. He had engaged to storm the castle single-handed and bring back the trees, that was to furnish them wassail and solace. And all that stood between him and the coveted $1 was his wife, once a little girl whom he could, why not again? Once with soft words he could, as they say, twist her around his little finger. Why not again? Not for years had he tried it. Grim poverty and mutual hatred had killed all that. But Ragsy and Kid were waiting for him to bring the $1. Mr. Peters took a surreptitiously keen look at his wife. Her formless bulk overflowed the chair. She kept her eyes fixed out the window in a strange kind of trance. Her eyes showed that she had been recently weeping. "I wonder," said Mr. Peters to himself, "if there'd be anything in it." The window was open upon its outlook of brick walls and drab, barren backyards. Except for the mildness of the air that entered it might have been midwinter yet in the city that turns such a frowny face to besieging spring. But spring doesn't come with the thunder of cannon. She is a sapper and a miner. and you must capitulate." "I'll try it," said Mr. Peters to himself, making a wry face. He went up to his wife and put his arm across her shoulders. "Clara, darling," he said in tones that shouldn't have fooled a baby seal, "why should we have hard words? Ain't you my own tootsome wootsums? A black mark against you, Mr. Peters, in the essay, Red Ledger of Cupid. Charges of attempted graft are filed against you, and of forgery and utterance of two of love's holiest of appellations." But the miracle of spring was wrought. Into the back room over the back alley between the black walls had crept the harbinger. It was ridiculous, and yet, well, it is a rat trap, and you, madam and sir and all of us, are in it. Red and fat and crying like Niobe or Niagara, Mrs. Peters threw her arms around her lord and dissolved upon him. Mr. Peters would have striven to extricate the dollar bill from its deposit vault, but his arms were bound to his sides. "Do you love me, James?" asked Mrs. Peters. "Madly," said James, "but—" "You are ill," exclaimed Mrs. Peters. "Why are you so pale and tired-looking?" "I feel weak," said Mr. Peters. "Oh, wait, I know what it is. Wait, James. I'll be back in a minute." With a parting bug that revived in Mr. Peters' recollections of the terrible Turk, his wife hurried out of the room and down the stairs. Mr. Peters hitched his thumbs under his suspenders. "All right," he confided to the ceiling. "I've got her going. I hadn't any idea the old girl was soft any more under the foolish rib. Well, sir, ain't I the Claude Melnot of the Lower East Side? What? It's a 100-to-1 shot that I get the dollar. I wonder what she went out for. I guess she's gone to tell Mrs. Muldoon on the second floor that we're reconciled. I'll remember this. Soft soap. And Ragsy was talking about slugging her." Mrs. Peters came back with a bottle of sarsaparilla. "I'm glad I happened to have that dollar," she said. "You're all run down, Boney." Mr. Peters had a tablespoonful of the stuff served into him. Then Mrs. Peters sat on his lap and murmured, "Call me tootsome wootsums again, James." He sat still, held there by his materialized goddess of spring. Spring had come. On the bench in Union Square, Mr. Ragsdale and Mr. Kidd squirmed, tongue-parched, awaiting D'Artagnan and his dollar. "I wish I had choked her at first," said Mr. Peters to himself. The Handbook of Hymen, by O. Henry. "'Tis the opinion of myself, Sanderson Pratt, who sets this down, that the educational system of the United States should be in the hands of the Weather Bureau. I can give you good reasons for it. And you can't tell me why our college professors shouldn't be transferred to the meteorological department. They have been learned to read, and they could very easily glance at the morning papers and then wire into the main office what kind of weather to expect. But there's the other side of the proposition. I am going on to tell you how the weather furnished me in Idaho Green with an elegant education. We was up in the Bitterroot Mountains over the Montana line prospecting for gold. A chin-whiskered man in Walla Walla, carrying a line of hope as excess baggage, had grub-staked us. And there we was in the foothills pecking away, with enough grub on hand to last an army through a peace conference. Along one day comes a mail rider over the mountains from Carlos, and stops to eat 3 cans of greengages, and leave us a newspaper of modern date. This paper prints a system of premonitions of the weather, and the card it dealt Bitterroot Mountains from the bottom of the deck was warmer and fair, with light westerly breezes. That evening it began to snow, with the wind strong in the east. Me and Idaho moved camp into an old empty cabin higher up the mountain, thinking it was only a November flurry. But after falling 3 foot on a level, it went to work in earnest, and we knew we was snowed in. We got in plenty of firewood before it got deep, and we had grub enough for 2 months, so we let the elements rage and cut up all they thought proper. If you want to instigate the art of manslaughter, just shut 2 men up in an 18 by 20-foot cabin for a month. Human nature won't stand it. When the first snowflakes fell, me and Idaho Green laughed at each other's jokes and praised the stuff we turned out of a skillet and called bread. At the end of 3 weeks, Idaho makes this kind of a edict to me. Says he, "I never exactly heard sour milk dropping out of a balloon on the bottom of a tin pan, but I have an idea it would be music of the spears compared to this attenuated stream of asphyxiated thought that emanates out of your organs of conversation. The kind of half masticated noises that you emit every day puts me in mind of a cow's cud. Only she's lady enough to keep hers to herself, and you ain't. Mr. Green, says I, you having been a friend of mine once, I have some hesitations in confessing to you that if I had my choice for society between you and a common yellow, three-legged cur pup, one of the inmates of this here cabin would be wagging a tail just at present. This way we goes on for 2 or 3 days, and then we quit speaking to one another. We divides up the cooking implements, and Idaho cooks his grub on one side of the fireplace, and me on the other. The snow is up to the windows, and we have to keep a fire all day. You see, me in Idaho never had any education beyond reading and doing if John had 3 apples and James 5 on a slate. We never felt any special need for a university degree, though we had acquired a species of intrinsic intelligence in knocking around the world that we could use in emergencies. But, snowbound in that cabin in the Bitterroots, we felt for the first time that if we had studied Homer or Greek and fractions and the higher branches of information, we'd have had some resources in the line of meditation and private thought. I've seen them Eastern College fellows working in camps all through the West, and I never noticed but what education was less of a drawback to him than you would think. Why, once over on Snake River, when Andrew McWilliams' saddle horse got the bots, he sent a buckboard 10 miles for one of these strangers that claimed to be a botanist. But that horse died. One morning Idaho was poking around with a stick on top of a little shelf that was too high to reach. 2 books fell down to the floor. I started toward him, but caught Idaho's eye. He speaks for the first time in a week. Don't burn your fingers, says he. In spite of the fact that you're only fit to be the companion of a sleeping mud turtle, I'll give you a square deal. And that's more than your parents did when they turned you loose in the world with the sociability of a rattlesnake and the bedside manner of a frozen turnip. I'll play you a game of 7-Up, the winner to pick up his choice of the book, the loser to take the other. We played, and Idaho won. He picked up his book, and I took mine. Then each of us got on his side of the house and went to reading. I never was as glad to see a 10-ounce nugget as I was that book, and Idaho took it as like a kid looks at a stick of candy. Mine was a little book about 5 by 6 inches called Herkimer's Handbook of Indispensable Information. I may be wrong, but I think that was the greatest book that ever was written. I've got it today, and I can stump you or any man 50 times in 5 minutes with the information in it. Talk about Solomon or the New York Tribune. Herkimer had cases on both of them. That man must have put in 50 years and traveled 1,000,000 miles to find out all that stuff. There was the population of all cities in it, and the way to tell a girl's age, and the number of teeth a camel has. It told you the longest tunnel in the world, the number of the stars, how long it takes for chicken pox to break out, what a lady's neck ought to measure, the veto powers of governors, the dates of the Roman aqueducts, how many pounds of rice going without 3 beers a day would buy, the average annual temperature of Augusta, Maine, the quantity of seed required to plant an acre of carrots and drills, antidotes for poisons, the number of hairs on a blonde lady's head, how to preserve eggs, the height of all the mountains in the world, and the dates of all wars and battles, and how to restore drowned persons and sunstroke, and the number of tacks in a pound, and how to make dynamite and flowers and beds, and what to do before the doctor comes and 100 times as many things besides. If there was anything Herkimer didn't know, I didn't miss it out of the book. I sat and read that book for 4 hours. All the wonders of education was compressed in it. I forgot the snow, and I forgot that me and old Idaho was on the outs. He was sitting still on a stool reading away with a kind of partly soft and partly mysterious look shining through his tan bark whiskers. Idaho, says I, what kind of a book is yours? Idaho must have forgot, too, for he answered moderate, without any slander or malignity. Why, says he, this here seems to be a volume by Homer K. M. Homer K. M. What? I asks. Why, just Homer K. M., says he. You're a liar, says I, a little riled that Idaho should try to put me up a tree. No man is going round signing books with his initials. If it's Homer K. M. Spupendike, or Homer K. M. McSweeney, or Homer K. M. Jones, why don't you say so like a man instead of biting off the end of it like a calf chewing off the tail of a shirt on a clothes line? I put it to you straight, Sandy, says Idaho, quiet. It's a poem book, says he, by Homer K. M. I couldn't get color out of it at first, but there's a vein if you follow it up. I wouldn't have missed this book for a pair of red blankets. You're welcome to it, says I. What I want is a disinterested statement of facts for the mind to work on, and that's what I seem to find in the book I've drawn. What you've got, says Idaho, is statistics, the lowest grade of information that exists. They'll poison your mind. Give me old K.M.'s system of surmises. He seems to be a kind of a wine agent. His regular toast is nothing doing, and he seems to have a grouch, but he keeps it so well lubricated with booze that his worst kicks sound like an invitation to split a quart. But it's poetry, says Idaho, and I have sensations of scorn for that truck of yours that tries to convey sense in feet and inches. When it comes to explaining the instinct of philosophy through the art of nature, old K.M. has got your man beat by drills, rows, paragraphs, chest measurement, and average annual rainfall. So that's the way me and Idaho had it. Day and night all the excitement we got was studying our books. That snowstorm sure fixed us with a fine lot of attainments apiece. By the time the snow melted, if you had stepped up to me suddenly and said, Sanderson Pratt, what would it cost per square foot to lay a roof with 20 by 20, 8 tin at $9.50 per box? I'd have told you as quick as light could travel the length of a spade handle at the rate of 192,000 miles per second. How many can do it? You wake up most any man you know in the middle of the night and ask him quick to tell you the number of bones in the human skeleton exclusive of the teeth, or what percentage of the vote of the Nebraska legislature overrules a veto. Will he tell you? Try him and see. About what benefit Idaho got out of his poetry book, I didn't exactly know. Idaho boosted the wine agent every time he opened his mouth, but I wasn't so sure. This Homer K.M., from what leaked out of his libretto through Idaho, seemed to me to be a kind of a dog who looked at life like it was a tin can tied to his tail. After running himself half to death, he sits down, hangs his tongue out, and looks at the can and says, "Oh well, since we can't shake the growler, let's get it filled at the corner, and I'll have a drink on me." Besides that, it seems he was a Persian, and I never hear of Persia producing anything worth mentioning unless it was Turkish rugs and Maltese cats. That spring me in Idaho struck payor. It was a habit of ours to sell out quick and keep moving. We unloaded our grubstaker for $8,000 apiece, and then we drifted down to this little town of Rosa on the Salmon River to rest up and get some human grub and have our whiskers harvested. Rosa was no mining camp. It laid in the valley and was as free of uproar and pestilence as one of them rural towns in the country. There was a 3-mile trolley line champing its bit in the environs, and me and Idaho spent a week riding on one of the cars, dropping off at nights at the Sunset View Hotel. Being now well-read as well as traveled, we was soon pro re nata with the best society in Rosa, and was invited out to the most dressed-up and high-toned entertainments. It was at a piano recital and quail-eating contest in the City Hall, for the benefit of the fire company, that me and Idaho first met Mrs. de Ormond Sampson, the queen of Rosa society. Mrs. Sampson was a widow and owned the only 2-story house in town. It was painted yellow, and whichever way you looked from you could see it as plain as egg on the chin of an O'Grady on a Friday. 22 men in Rosa besides me and Idaho was trying to stake a claim on that yellow house. There was a dance after the songbooks and quail bones had been raked out of the hall. 23 of the bunch galloped over to Mrs. Sampson and asked for a dance. I sidestepped the 2-step and asked permission to escort her home. That's where I made a hit. On the way home, says she, "Ain't the stars lovely and bright tonight, Mr. Pratt?" "For the chance they've got," says I, "they're humping themselves in a mighty creditable way. That big one you see is 66 million miles distant. It took 36 years for its light to reach us. With an 18-foot telescope you can see 43 millions of them, including them of the 13th magnitude, which, if one was to go out now, you would keep on seeing it for 2,700 years. "My," says Mrs. Sampson, "I never knew that before. How warm it is. I'm as damp as I can be from dancing so much." "That's easy to account for," says I, "when you happen to know that you've got 2 million sweat glands working all at once. If every one of your perspiratory ducts, which are 1/4 of an inch long, was placed end to end, they would reach a distance of 7 miles. "Lawsy," says Mrs. Sampson. It sounds like an irrigation ditch you was describing, Mr. Pratt. How do you get all this knowledge of information? From observation, Mrs. Sampson, I tells her. I keep my eyes open when I go about the world. Mr. Pratt, says she, I always did admire a man of education. There are so few scholars among the sap-headed plug-uglies of this town that it is a real pleasure to converse with a gentleman of culture. I'd be gratified to have you call at my house whenever you feel so inclined. And that was the way I got the goodwill of the lady in the yellow house. Every Tuesday and Friday evening, I used to go there and tell her about the wonders of the universe as discovered, tabulated, and compiled from nature by Herkimer. Idaho and the other gay Lutherans of the town got every minute of the rest of the week that they could. I never imagined that Idaho was trying to work on Mrs. Sampson with old K.M.'s rules of courtship till one afternoon when I was on my way over to take her a basket of wild hog plums. I met the lady coming down the lane that led to her house. Her eyes was snapping, and her hat made a dangerous dip over one eye. Mr. Pratt, she opens up, this Mr. Green is a friend of yours, I believe. For 9 years, says I. Cut him out, says she. He's no gentleman. Why, ma'am, says I, he's a plain incumbent of the mountains, with asperities and the usual failings of a spendthrift and a liar, but I never on the most momentous occasion had the heart to deny that he was a gentleman. It may be that in haberdashery and the sense of arrogance and display Idaho offends the eye, but inside, ma'am, I found him impervious to the lower grades of crime and obesity. After 9 years of Idaho's society, Mrs. Sampson, I winds up, I should hate to impute him, and I should hate to see him imputed. It's right plausible of you, Mr. Pratt, says Mrs. Sampson, to take up the curmudgeons in your friend's behalf, but it don't alter the fact that he has made proposals to me sufficiently obnoxious to ruffle the ignominy of any lady. Why, now, says I, old Idaho do that. I could believe it of myself, sooner. I never knew but one thing to deride in him, and a blizzard was responsible for that. Once while we was snowbound in the mountains he became a prey to a kind of spurious and uneven poetry, which may have corrupted his demeanor. It has, says Mrs. Sampson. Ever since I knew him he has been reciting to me a lot of irreligious rhymes by some person he calls Rubaiyat, and who is no better than she should be, if you judge by her poetry. Then Idaho has struck a new book, says I, for the one he had was by a man who writes under the nom de plume of K.M. He'd better have stuck to it, says Mrs. Sampson, whatever it was. And today he caps the vortex. I get a bunch of flowers from him, and on M is pinned a note. Now, Mr. Pratt, you know a lady when you see her, and you know how I stand in Rosa society. Do you think for a moment that I'd skip out to the woods with a man along with a jug of wine and a loaf of bread, and go singing and cavorting up and down under the trees with him? I take a little claret with my meals, but I'm not in the habit of packing a jug of it into the brush and raising Cain in any such style as that. And of course he'd bring his book of verses along, too. He said so. Let him go on his scandalous picnics alone, or let him take his Rubaiyat with him. I reckon she wouldn't kick unless it was on account of there being too much bread along. And what do you think of your gentleman friend now, Mr. Pratt? Well, says I, it may be that Idaho's invitation was a kind of poetry and meant no harm. Maybe it belonged to the class of rhymes they call figurative. They offend law and order, but they get sent through the mails on the grounds that they mean something that they don't say. I'd be glad on Idaho's account if you'd overlook it, says I, and let us extricate our minds from the low regions of poetry to the higher planes of fact and fancy. On a beautiful afternoon like this, Mrs. Sampson, I goes on, we should let our thoughts dwell accordingly. Though it is warm here, we should remember that at the equator the line of perpetual frost is at an altitude of 15,000 feet. Between the latitudes of 40 degrees and 49 degrees, it is from 4,000 to 9,000 feet. Oh, Mr. Pratt, says Mrs. Sampson, it's such a comfort to hear you say them beautiful facts after getting such a jar from that minx of a Ruby's poetry. Let us sit on this log at the roadside, says I, and forget the inhumanity and ribaldry of the poets. It is in the glorious columns of ascertained facts and legalized measures that beauty is to be found. In this very log we sit upon, Mrs. Sampson, says I, is statistics more wonderful than any poem. The rings show it was 60 years old. At the depth of 2,000 feet, it would become coal in 3,000 years. The deepest coal mine in the world is at Killingworth, near Newcastle. A box 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 2 feet 8 inches deep will hold 1 ton of coal. If an artery is cut, compress it above the wound. A man's leg contains 30 bones. The Tower of London was burned in 1841. Go on, Mr. Pratt, says Mrs. Sampson. Them ideas is so original and soothing. I think statistics are just as lovely as they can be. But it wasn't till 2 weeks later that I got all that was coming to me out of Herkimer. One night I was waked up by folks hollering fire all around. I jumped up and dressed and went out of the hotel to enjoy the scene. When I see it was Mrs. Sampson's house, I gave forth a kind of yell, and I was there in 2 minutes. The whole lower story of the yellow house was in flames, and every masculine, feminine, and canine in Rosa was there, screeching and barking and getting in the way of the firemen. I saw Idaho trying to get away from 6 firemen who were holding him. They was telling him the whole place was on fire downstairs, and no man could go in it and come out alive. Where's Mrs. Sampson? I asks. She hasn't been seen, says one of the firemen. She sleeps upstairs. We've tried to get in, but we can't, and our company hasn't got any ladders yet. I runs around to the light of the big blaze and pulls the handbook out of my inside pocket. I kind of laughed when I felt it in my hands. I reckon I was some daffy with the sensation of excitement. Herky, old boy, I says to it, as I flipped over the pages, you ain't ever lied to me yet, and you ain't ever throwed me down at a scratch yet. Tell me what, old boy, tell me what, says I. I turned to What to Do in Case of Accidents on page 117. I run my finger down the page and struck it. Good old Herkimer. He never overlooked anything. It said, suffocation from inhaling smoke or gas. There is nothing better than flaxseed. Place a few seed in the outer corner of the eye. I shoved the handbook back in my pocket and grabbed a boy that was running by. Here, says I, giving him some money, run to the drugstore and bring $1 worth of flaxseed. Hurry, and you'll get another one for yourself. Now, I sings out to the crowd, we'll have Mrs. Sampson, and I throws away my coat and hat. 4 of the firemen and citizens grabs hold of me. It's sure death, they say, to go in the house, for the floors was beginning to fall through. How in blazes, I sings out, kind of laughing yet, but not feeling like it. Do you expect me to put flaxseed in an eye without the eye? I jabbed each elbow in a fireman's face, kicked the bark off of one citizen's shin, and tripped the other one with a side hold. And then I busted into the house. If I die first, I'll write you a letter and tell you if it's any worse down there than the inside of that yellow house was. But don't believe it yet. I was a heap more cooked than the hurry-up orders of broiled chicken that you get in restaurants. The fire and smoke had me down on the floor twice, and was about to shame Herkimer, but the firemen helped me with their little stream of water, and I got to Mrs. Sampson's room. She'd lost conscientiousness from the smoke, so I wrapped her in the bedclothes and got her on my shoulder. Well, the floors wasn't as bad as they said, or I never could have done it, not by no means. I carried her out 50 yards from the house and laid her on the grass. Then, of course, every one of them other 22 plaintiffs to the lady's hand crowded around with tin dippers of water ready to save her. And up runs the boy with the flaxseed. I unwrapped the covers from Mrs. Sampson's head. She opened her eyes and says, "Is that you, Mr. Pratt?" "SSSH," says I. "Don't talk till you've had the remedy." I runs my arm around her neck and raises her head, gentle, and breaks the bag of flaxseed with the other hand. And as easy as I could I bends over and slips 3 or 4 of the seeds in the outer corner of her eye. Up gallops the village doc by this time, and snorts around, and grabs at Mrs. Sampson's pulse, and wants to know what I mean by any such sand-blasted nonsense. "Well, old Jalap and Jerusalem Oakseed," says I, "I'm no regular practitioner, but I'll show you my authority, anyway." They fetched my coat, and I gets out the handbook. "Look on page 117, says I, "at the remedy for suffocation by smoke or gas. Flaxseed in the outer corner of the eye, it says. I don't know whether it works as a smoke consumer or whether it hikes the compound gastrohippopotamus nerve into action, but Herkimer says it, and he was called to the case first. If you want to make it a consultation, there's no objection. Old Doc takes the book and looks at it by means of his specs and a fireman's lantern. Well, Mr. Pratt, says he, you evidently got on the wrong line in reading your diagnosis. The recipe for suffocation says, get the patient into fresh air as quickly as possible and place in a reclining position. The flaxseed remedy is for dust and cinders in the eye, on the line above. But, after all, see here, interrupts Mrs. Sampson, I reckon I've got something to say in this consultation. That flaxseed done me more good than anything I ever tried. And then she raises up her head and lays it back on my arm again and says, put some in the other eye, Sandy dear. And so if you was to stop off at Rosa tomorrow, or any other day, you'd see a fine new yellow house with Mrs. Pratt, that was Mrs. Sampson, embellishing and adorning it. And if you was to step inside, you'd see on the marble-top center table in the parlor, Herkimer's Handbook of Indispensable Information, all rebound in red morocco, and ready to be consulted on any subject pertaining to human happiness and wisdom. The Hand That Riles the World, by O. Henry. Many of our great men, said I, apropos of many things, have declared that they owe their success to the aid and encouragement of some brilliant woman. I know, said Jeff Peters. I've read in history and mythology about Joan of Arc and Madame Yale and Mrs. Caudle and even other noted females of the past. But, in my opinion, the woman of today is of little use in politics or business. What's she best in, anyway? Men make the best cooks, milliners, nurses, housekeepers, stenographers, clerks, hairdressers, and launderers. About the only job left that a woman can beat a man in is female impersonator in vaudeville. I would have thought, said I, that occasionally anyhow, you would have found the wit and intuition of woman valuable to you in your lines of her business. Now, wouldn't you, said Jeff, with an emphatic nod, wouldn't you have imagined that? But a woman is an absolutely unreliable partner in any straight swindle. She's liable to turn honest on you when you are depending upon her the most. I tried him once. Bill Humble, an old friend of mine in the territories, conceived the illusion that he wanted to be appointed United States Marshal. At that time me and Andy was doing a square, legitimate business of selling walking canes. If you unscrewed the head of one and turned it up to your mouth, a half pint of good rye whiskey would go trickling down your throat to reward you for your act of intelligence. The deputies was annoying me and Andy some, and when Bill spoke to me about his officious aspirations, I saw how the appointment as marshal might help along the firm of Peters and Amp, Tucker. Jeff, says Bill to me, you are a man of learning and education, besides having knowledge and information concerning not only rudiments but facts and attainments. I do, says I, and I have never regretted it. I am not one, says I, who would cheapen education by making it free. Tell me, says I, which is of the most value to mankind, literature or horse racking? Why, playing the mean, of course. The poets and the great writers have got the call, of course, says Bill. Exactly, says I. Then why do the masterminds of finance and philanthropy, says I, charge us $2 to get into a racetrack and let us into a library free? Is that distilling into the masses, says I, a correct estimate of the relative value of the two means of self, culture, and disorder? You are arguing outside of my faculties of sense and rhetoric, says Bill. What I wanted you to do is to go to Washington and dig out this appointment for me. I haven't no ideas of cultivation and intrigue. I'm a plain citizen and I need the job. I've killed 7 men, says Bill. I've got 9 children. I've been a good Republican ever since the 1st of May. I can't read nor write, and I see no reason why I ain't eligible for the office. And I think your partner, Mr. Tucker, goes on Bill, is also a man of sufficient ingratiation and connected system of mental delinquency to assist you in securing the appointment. I will give you preliminary, says Bill, $1,000 for drinks, bribes, and car fare in Washington. If you land the job, I will pay you $1,000 more, cash down, and guarantee you impunity in boot, legging whiskey for 12 months. Are you patriotic to the West enough to help me put this thing through the whitewashed wigwam of the great father of the most eastern flag station of the Pennsylvania Railroad? Says Bill. Well, I talked to Andy about it, and he liked the idea immense. Andy was a man of an involved nature. He was never content to plod along, as I was, selling to the peasantry some little tool like a combination stake beater, shoehorn, Marcel waver, monkey wrench, nail file, potato masher, and multum and parvo tuning fork. Andy had the artistic temper, which is not to be judged as a preacher's or a moral man's is by purely commercial deflections. So we accepted Bill's offer and strikes out for Washington. Says I to Andy, when we get located at a hotel on South Dakota Avenue, GSSW, now Andy, for the first time in our lives we've got to do a real dishonest act. Lobbying is something we've never been used to, but we've got to scandalize ourselves for Bill Humble's sake. In a straight and legitimate business, says I, we could afford to introduce a little foul play and chicanery, but in a disorderly and heinous piece of malpractice like this it seems to me that the straightforward and above-board way is the best. I propose, says I, that we hand over $500 of this money to the chairman of the National Campaign Committee, get a receipt, lay the receipt on the president's desk, and tell him about Bill. The president is a man who would appreciate a candidate who went about getting office that way instead of pulling wires. Andy agreed with me, but after we talked the scheme over with the hotel clerk, we give that plan up. He told us that there was only one way to get an appointment in Washington, and that was through a lady lobbyist. He gave us the address of one he recommended, a Mrs. Avery, who he said was high up in sociable and diplomatic rings and circles. The next morning at 10 o'clock me and Andy called at her hotel and was shown up to her reception room. This Mrs. Avery was a solace and a balm to the eyesight. She had hair the color of the back of a $20 gold certificate, blue eyes, and a system of beauty that would make the girl on the cover of a July magazine look like a cook on a Monongahela coal barge. She had on a low-neck dress covered with silver spangles and diamond rings and earbobs. Her arms was bare, and she was using a desk telephone with one hand and drinking tea with the other. Well, boys, says she after a bit, what is it? I told her in as few words as possible what we wanted for Bill and the price we could pay. Those Western appointments, says she, are easy. Let me see now, says she, who could put that through for us. No use fooling with the territorial delegates. I guess, says she, that Senator Sniper would be about the man. He's from somewheres in the West. Let's see how he stands on my private menu card. She takes some papers out of a pigeonhole with the letter S over it. Yes, says she, he's marked with a star. That means ready to serve. Now, let's see. Age 55, married twice, Presbyterian, likes blondes, Tolstoy, poker, and stewed terrapin, sentimental at third bottle of wine. Yes, she goes on, I am sure I can have your friend, Mr. Bummer, appointed minister to Brazil. Humble, says I, and United States Marshal was the birth. Oh, yes, says Mrs. Avery. I have so many deals of this sort I sometimes get them confused. Give me all the memoranda you have of the case, Mr. Peters, and come back in 4 days. I think it can be arranged by then. So me and Andy goes back to our hotel and waits. Andy walks up and down and chews the left end of his mustache. A woman of high intellect and perfect beauty is a rare thing, Jeff, says he. As rare, says I, as an omelet made from the eggs of the fabulous bird known as the epidermis, says I. A woman like that, says Andy, ought to lead a man to the highest positions of opulence and fame. I misdoubt, says I, if any woman ever helped a man to secure a job any more than to have his meals ready promptly and spread a report that the other candidate's wife had once been a shoplifter. They are no more adapted for business and politics, says I, than Algernon Charles Swinburne is to be floor manager at one of Chuck Connor's annual balls. I know, says I to Andy, that sometimes a woman seems to step out into the calcimine light as the charge d'affaires of her man's political job. But how does it come out? Say, they have a neat little berth somewhere as foreign consul of record to Afghanistan or lockkeeper on the Delaware and Raritan Canal. One day this man finds his wife putting on her overshoes and 3 months' supply of bird seed into the canary's cage. Sioux Falls? He asks with a kind of hopeful light in his eye. No, Arthur, says she. Washington. We're wasted here, says she. You ought to be toady extraordinary to the court of St. Bridget, or head porter of the island of Puerto Rico. I'm going to see about it. Then this lady, I says to Andy, moves against the authorities at Washington with her baggage and munitions, consisting of 5 dozen indiscriminating letters written to her by a member of the cabinet when she was 15, a letter of introduction from King Leopold to the Smithsonian Institution, and a pink silk costume with canary-colored spats. Well, and then what? I goes. She has the letters printed in the evening papers that match her costume. She lectures at an informal tea given in the palm room of the B. An amp. Oh, depot, and then calls on the president. The 9th Assistant Secretary of Commerce and Labor, the first aide-de-camp of the Blue Room, and an unidentified colored man are waiting there to grasp her by the hands and feet. They carry her out to SWB Street and leave her on a cellar door. That ends it. The next time we hear of her, she is writing postcards to the Chinese minister, asking him to get Arthur a job in a tea store. Then, says Andy, you don't think Mrs. Avery will land the marshalship for Bill? I do not, says I. I do not wish to be a skeptic, but I doubt if she can do as well as you and me could have done. I don't agree with you, says Andy. I'll bet you she does. I'm proud of having a higher opinion of the talent and the powers of negotiation of ladies. We was back at Mrs. Avery's hotel at the time she appointed. She was looking pretty and fine enough, as far as that went, to make any man let her name every officer in the country. But I hadn't much faith in looks, so I was certainly surprised when she pulls out a document with the Great Seal of the United States on it, and William Henry Humble in a fine, big hand on the back. You might have had it the next day, boys, says Mrs. Avery, smiling. I hadn't the slightest trouble in getting it, says she. I just asked for it, that's all. Now, I'd like to talk to you a while, she goes on, but I'm awfully busy, and I know you'll excuse me. I've got an ambassadorship, 2 consulates, and a dozen other minor applications to look after. I can hardly find time to sleep at all. You'll give my compliments to Mr. Humble when you get home, of course. Well, I handed her the $500, which she pitched into her desk drawer without counting. I put Bill's appointment in my pocket, and me and Andy made our adieus. We started back for the territory the same day. We wired Bill, job landed, get the tall glasses ready, and we felt pretty good. Andy joshed me all the way about how little I knew about women. All right, says I. I'll admit that she surprised me. But it's the first time I ever knew one of him to manipulate a piece of business on time without getting it bungled up in some way, says I. Down about the edge of Arkansas, I got out Bill's appointment and looked it over, and then I handed it to Andy to read. Andy read it, but didn't add any remarks to my silence. The paper was for Bill, all right, and a genuine document, but it appointed him postmaster of Dade City, Florida. Me and Andy got off the train at Little Rock and sent Bill's appointment to him by mail. Then we struck northeast toward Lake Superior. I never saw Bill Humble after that. The Halberdier of the Little Ranch Loss. By O. Henry. I go sometimes into the beer hall and restaurant called Old Munich. Not long ago it was a resort of interesting bohemians, but now only artists and musicians and literary folk frequent it. But the Pilsner is yet good, and I take some diversion from the conversation of waiter number 18. For many years the customers of Old Munich have accepted the place as a faithful copy from the ancient German town. The big hall with its smoky rafters, rows of imported steins, portrait of Goethe, and verses painted on the walls translated into German from the original of the Cincinnati poets seems atmospherically correct when viewed through the bottom of a glass. But not long ago the proprietors added the room above, called it the Little Ranchloss, and built in a stairway. Up there was an imitation stone parapet, ivy-covered, and the walls were painted to represent depth and distance, with the Rhine winding at the base of the vineyard slopes, and the castle of Ehrenbreitstein looming directly opposite the entrance. Of course there were tables and chairs, and you could have beer and food brought you, as you naturally would on the top of a castle on the Rhine. I went into Old Munich one afternoon when there were few customers, and sat at my usual table near the stairway. I was shocked and almost displeased to perceive that the glass cigar case by the orchestra stand had been smashed to smithereens. I did not like things to happen in Old Munich, Nothing had ever happened there before. Waiter number 18 came and breathed on my neck. I was his by right of discovery. 18's brain was built like a corral. It was full of ideas which, when he opened the gate, came huddling out like a flock of sheep that might get together afterward or might not. I did not shine as a shepherd, as a type 18 fitted nowhere. I did not find out if he had a nationality, family, creed, grievance, hobby, soul, preference, home, or vote. He only came always to my table and, as long as his leisure would permit, let words flutter from him like swallows leaving a barn at daylight. How did the cigar case come to be broken, 18? I asked, with a certain feeling of personal grievance. I can't tell you about that, sir, said he, resting his foot on the chair next to mine. Did you ever have anybody hand you a double handful of good luck, while both your hands were full of bad luck, and stop to notice how your fingers behaved? No riddles, 18, said I. Leave out palmistry and manicuring. You remember, said 18, the guy in the hammered brass Prince Albert and the oro-eyed gold pants and the amalgamated copper hat, that carried the combination meat axe, ice pick, and liberty pole, and used to stand on the first landing as you go up to the little Rhine slosh. Why, yes, said I, the halberdier. I never noticed him particularly. I remember he thought he was only a suit of armor. He had a perfect poise. He had more than that, said 18. He was me friend. He was an advertisement. The boss hired him to stand on the stairs for a kind of scenery to show there was something doing in the has-been line upstairs. What did you call him, eh? What kind of beer? A halberdier, said I. That was an ancient man-at-arms of many hundred years ago. Some mistake, said 18. This one wasn't that old. He wasn't over 23 or 4. It was the boss's idea, rigging a man up in an antebellum suit of tinware and standing him on the landing of the slosh. He bought the goods at a 4th Avenue antique store and hung a sign out, able-bodied halberdier wanted. Costume furnished. The same morning a young man with wrecked good clothes and a hungry look comes in, bringing the sign with him. I was filling the mustard pots at my station. I'm it, says he, whatever it is, but I never halberdiered in a restaurant. Put me on. Is it a masquerade? I hear talk in the kitchen of a fishball, says I. Bully for you, 18, says he. You and I'll get on. Show me the boss's desk. Well, the boss tries the Harveyized pajamas on him, and they fitted him like the scales on a baked red snapper, and he gets the job. You've seen what it is. He stood straight up in the corner of the first landing with his halberd to his shoulder, looking right ahead and guarding the Portugals of the castle. The boss is nutty about having the true old-world flavor to his joint. Halberdiers goes with rinsloshes, says he, just as rats goes with rotskellers and white cotton stockings with Tyrolean villages. The boss is a kind of antiologist and is all posted up on data and such information. From 8 p.m. to 2 in the morning was the halberdier's hours. He got 2 meals with us help and $1 a night. I eat with him at the table. He liked me. He never told his name. He was traveling impromptu, like kings, I guess. The first time at supper I says to him, have some more of the spuds, Mr. Frelinghuysen. Oh, don't be so formal and offish, 18, says he. Call me Hal, that's short for halberdier. Oh, don't think I wanted to pry for names, says I. I know all about the dizzy fall from wealth and greatness. We've got to count washing dishes in the kitchen, and the third bartender used to be a Pullman conductor. And they /work/ Sir Percival, says I, sarcastic. 18, says he, as a friendly devil in a cabbage-scented hell. Would you mind cutting up this piece of steak for me? I don't say that it's got more muscle than I have, but... And then he shows me the insides of his hands. They was blistered and cut and corned and swelled up till they looked like a couple of flank steaks crossed with a knife, the kind the butchers hide and take home, knowing what is the best. Shoveling coal, says he, and piling bricks and loading drays. But they gave out, and I had to resign. I was born for a halberdier, and I've been educated for 24 years to fill the position. Now, quit knocking my profession, and pass along a lot more of that ham. I'm holding the closing exercises, says he, of a 48-hour fast. The second night he was on the job, he walks down from his corner to the cigar case and calls for cigarettes. The customers at the tables all snicker out loud to show their acquaintance with history. The boss is on. And let's see, oh, yes, an anachronism, says the boss. Cigarettes was not made at the time when halberdiers was invented. The ones you sell was, says Sir Percival. Caporal wins from chronology by the length of a cork tip. So he gets M and lights one, and puts the box in his brass helmet and goes back to patrolling the Rhineslosh. He made a big hit, especially with the ladies. Some of them would poke him with their fingers to see if he was real or only a kind of a stuffed figure like they burn in elegy. And when he'd move they'd squeak and make eyes at him as they went up to the slosh. He looked fine in his haberdashery. He slept at $2 a week in a hall room on 3rd Avenue. He invited me up there one night. He had a little book on the washstand that he read instead of shopping in the saloons after hours. I'm on to that, says I, from reading about it in novels. All the heroes on the bum carry the little book. It's either Tantalus or Liver or Horace, and it's printed in Latin, and you're a college man. And I wouldn't be surprised, says I, if you wasn't educated too. But it was only the batting averages of the league for the last 10 years. One night, about 11:30, there comes in a party of these high rollers that are always hunting up new places to eat in and poke fun at. There was a swell girl in a 40 HP auto tan coat and veil, and a fat old man with white side whiskers, and a young chap that couldn't keep his feet off the tail of the girl's coat, and an oldish lady that looked upon life as immoral and unnecessary. How perfectly delightful, they says, to sup in a slosh. Up the stairs they go, and in half a minute back down comes the girl, her skirts swishing like the waves on the beach. She stops on the landing and looks our halberdier in the eye. You, she says, with a smile that reminded me of lemon sherbet. I was waiting upstairs in the slosh, then, and I was right down here by the door, putting some vinegar and cayenne into an empty bottle of Tabasco, and I heard all they said. It, says Sir Percival without moving. I'm only local color. Are my hauberk, helmet, and halberd on straight? Is there an explanation to this? Says she. Is it a practical joke such as men play in those griddle cake and lamb clubs? I'm afraid I don't see the point. I heard, vaguely, that you were away. For 3 months, we have not seen you or heard from you. I'm halberdiering for my living, says the stature. I'm working, says he. I don't suppose you know what work means. Have you lost your money? She asks. Sir Percival studies a minute. I am poorer, says he, than the poorest sandwich man on the streets, if I don't earn my living. You call this work? Says she. I thought a man worked with his hands, or his head instead of becoming a mountebank. The calling of a halberdier, says he, is an ancient and honorable one. Sometimes, says he, the man-at-arms at the door has saved the castle while the plumed knights were cakewalking in the banquet halls above. I see you're not ashamed, says she, of your peculiar tastes. I wonder, though, that the manhood I used to think I saw and you didn't prompt you to draw water or HEW would instead of publicly flaunting your ignominy in this disgraceful masquerade. Sir Percival kind of rattles his armor and says, Helen, will you suspend sentence in this matter for just a little while? You don't understand, says he. I've got to hold this job down a little longer. You like being a harlequin or halberdier, as you call it? Says she. I wouldn't get thrown of the job just now, says he with a grin, to be appointed minister to the court of St. James's. And then the 40H.P. girl's eyes sparked as hard as diamonds. Very well, says she. You shall have full run of your serving man's tastes this night. And she swims over to the boss's desk and gives him a smile that knocks the specks off his nose. I think your Rhineslosh, says she, is as beautiful as a dream. It is a little slice of the old world set down in New York. We shall have a nice supper up there. But if you will grant us one favor, the illusion will be perfect. Give us your halberdier to wait on our table. That hits the boss's antiology hobby just right. Sure, says he, will be fine.
Und der Orchestraschall bläh die Wacht am Rhein all der Time.
And he goes over and tells the halberdier to go upstairs and hustle the grub at the swell's table. I'm on the job, says Sir Percival, taking off his helmet and hanging it on his halberd and leaning him in the corner. The girl goes up and takes her seat, and I see her jaw squared tight under her smile. "We're going to be waited on by a real halberdier," says she, one who is proud of his profession. "Isn't it sweet?" "Ripping," says the swell young man. "Much prefer a waiter," says the fat old gent. "I hope he doesn't come from a cheap museum," says the old lady. "He might have microbes in his costume." Before he goes to the table, Sir Percival takes me by the arm. 18, he says, "I've got to pull off this job without a blunder. You coach me straight, or I'll take that halberd and make hash out of you." And then he goes up to the table with his coat of mail on and a napkin over his arm and waits for the order. "Why, it's Deering," says the young swell. "Hello, old man." "What the—" "Beg pardon, sir," interrupts the halberdier. "I'm waiting on the table." The old man looks at him grim, like a Boston bull. "So, Deering," he says, "you're at work yet?" "Yes, sir," says Sir Percival, quiet and gentlemanly as I could have been myself, "for almost 3 months now." "You haven't been discharged during the time?" asks the old man. "Not once, sir," says he, "though I've had to change my work several times." "Waiter," orders the girl, short and sharp, another napkin. He brings her one, respectful. I never saw more devil, if I may say it, stirred up in a lady. There was 2 bright red spots on her cheeks, and her eyes looked exactly like a wildcat's I'd seen in the zoo. Her foot kept slapping the floor all the time. "Waiter," she orders, "bring me filtered water without ice. Bring me a footstool. Take away this empty salt cellar." She kept him on the jump. She was sure giving the halberdier his. There wasn't but a few customers up in the slosh at that time, so I hung out near the door so I could help Sir Percival serve. He got along fine with the olives and celery and the blue points. They was easy. And then the consommé came up the dumbwaiter all in one big silver tureen. Instead of serving it from the side table, he picks it up between his hands and starts to the dining table with it. When nearly there, he drops the tureen smash on the floor, and the soup soaks all the lower part of that girl's swell silk dress. "Stupid incompetent," says she, giving him a look. "Standing in a corner with a halberd seems to be your mission in life." "Pardon me, lady," says he. "It was just a little bit hotter than blazes. I couldn't help it." The old man pulls out a memorandum book and hunts in it. "The 25th of April, Deering," says he. "I know it," says Sir Percival. "And 10 minutes to 12 o'clock, says the old man. "By Jupiter, you haven't won yet." And he pounds the table with his fist and yells to me, "Waiter, call the manager at once, tell him to hurry here as fast as he can." I go after the boss, and old Brockman hikes up to the slosh on the jump. "I want this man discharged at once," roads the old guy. "Look what he's done. Ruined my daughter's dress. It cost at least $600. Discharge this awkward lout at once, or I'll sue you for the price of it." "Dis is bad business," says the boss. $600 is much. I reckon I will have to—" "Wait a minute, Herr Brockman," says Sir Percival, easy and smiling. But he was worked up under his tin suitings. I could see that. And then he made the finest, neatest little speech I ever listened to. I can't give you the words, of course. He gave the millionaires a lovely roast in a sarcastic way, describing their automobiles and opera boxes and diamonds, and then he got around to the working classes and the kind of grub they eat and the long hours they work and all that sort of stuff bunkum, of course. "The restless rich," says he, "never content with their luxuries, always prowling among the haunts of the poor and humble, amusing themselves with the imperfections and misfortunes of their fellow men and women." And even here, Herr Brockman, he says, in this beautiful Rhine slosh, a grand and enlightening reproduction of old-world history and architecture, they come to disturb its symmetry and picturesqueness by demanding in their arrogance that the halberdier of the castle wait upon their table. "I have faithfully and conscientiously," says he, "performed my duties as a halberdier. I know nothing of a waiter's duties. It was the insolent whim of these transient, pampered aristocrats that I should be detailed to serve them food. Must I be blamed? Must I be deprived of the means of a livelihood?" He goes on on account of an accident that was the result of their own presumption and haughtiness? But what hurts me more than all, says Sir Percival, is the desecration that has been done to this splendid Rhineslosh, the confiscation of its halberdier to serve menially at the banquet board. Even I could see that this stuff was piffle, but it caught the boss. Mein Gott, says he, you vas right. Ein halberdier have not got der right to dish up soup. Him I will not discharge. Have an oder waiter if you like. UNE let mein halberdier go back UNE stand MIT his halberd. But, gentlemen, he says, pointing to the old man, you go ahead and sue MIT der dress. Sue me for $600 or $6,000.
Stand der Suit.
And the boss puffs off downstairs. Old Brockman was an all-right Dutchman. Just then the clock strikes 12, and the old guy laughs loud. You win, Deering, says he. And let me explain to all, he goes on. Some time ago Mr. Deering asked me for something that I did not want to give him. I looks at the girl, and she turns as red as a pickled beet. I told him, says the old guy, if he would earn his own living for 3 months without being discharged for incompetence, I would give him what he wanted. It seems that the time was up at 12 o'clock tonight. I came near fetching you, though, Deering, on that soup question, says the old boy, standing up and grabbing Sir Percival's hand. The halberdier lets out a yell and jumps 3 feet high. Look out for those hands, says he, and he holds him up. You never saw such hands except on a laborer in a limestone quarry. Heavens, boy, says old Side Whiskers, what have you been doing to him? Oh, says Sir Percival, little chores like hauling coal and excavating rock till they went back on me. And when I couldn't hold a pick or a whip, I took up halberdiering to give him a rest. Tureens full of hot soup don't seem to be a particularly soothing treatment. I would have bet on that girl. That high-tempered kind always go as far the other way, according to my experience. She whizzes round the table like a cyclone and catches both his hands in hers. Poor hands, dear hands, she sings out and sheds tears on him and holds him close to her bosom. Well, sir, with all that Rhineslosh scenery it was just like a play. And the halberdier sits down at the table at the girl's side, and I serve the rest of the supper. And that was about all, except that when they left he shed his hardware store and went with him. I dislike to be sidetracked from an original proposition. But you haven't told me, 18, said I, how the cigar case came to be broken. Oh, that was last night, said 18. Sir Percival and the girl drove up in a cream-colored motor car and had dinner in the Rhineslosh. The same table, Billy, I heard her say as they went up.
Ibaitaon,
We've got a new halberdier now, a bow-legged guy with a face like a sheep. As they came downstairs, Sir Percival passes him a tin case note. The new halberdier drops his halberd, and it falls on the cigar case. That's how that happened. The Guilty Party, an East Side Tragedy, by O. Henry. A red-haired, unshaven, untidy man sat in a rocking chair by a window. He had just lighted a pipe and was puffing blue clouds with great satisfaction. He had removed his shoes and donned a pair of blue, faded carpet slippers. With the morbid thirst of the confirmed Daily News drinker, he awkwardly folded back the pages of an evening paper, eagerly gulping down the strong, black headlines, to be followed as a chaser by the milder details of the smaller type. In an adjoining room a woman was cooking supper. Odors from strong bacon and boiling coffee contended against the cut-plug fumes from the vespertine pipe. Outside was one of those crowded streets of the East Side, in which, as twilight falls, Satan sets up his recruiting office. A mighty host of children danced and ran and played in the street, some in rags, some in clean white and beribboned, some wild and restless as young hawks, some gentle-faced and shrinking, some shrieking rude and sinful words, some listening, awed, but soon, grown familiar, to embrace here were the children playing in the corridors of the house of sin. Above the playground forever hovered a great bird. The bird was known to humorists as the stork, but the people of Christie Street were better ornithologists. They called it a vulture. A little girl of 12 came up timidly to the man reading and resting by the window and said, "Papa, won't you play a game of checkers with me if you aren't too tired?" The red-haired, unshaven, untidy man sitting shoeless by the window answered, with a frown, "Checkers? No, I won't. Can a man who works hard all day have a little rest when he comes home? Why don't you go out and play with the other kids on the sidewalk? The woman who was cooking came to the door. John, she said, I don't like for Lizzie to play in the street. They learn too much there that ain't good for him. She's been in the house all day long. It seems that you might give up a little of your time to amuse her when you come home. Let her go out and play like the rest of him if she wants to be amused, said the red-haired, unshaven, untidy man. And don't bother me. You're on, said Kid mullily. $50 to $25 I take Annie to the dance. Put up. The kid's black eyes were snapping with the fire of the baited and challenged. He drew out his roll and slapped 5 tins upon the bar. The 3 or 4 young fellows who were thus taken more slowly produced their stake. The bartender, ex officio stakeholder, took the money, laboriously wrapped it, recorded the bet with an inch-long pencil and stuffed the whole into a corner of the cash register. And, oh, what'll be done to you'll be a plenty, said a bettor, with anticipatory glee. That's my lookout, said the kid, sternly. Fill 'em up all around, Mike. After the round Burke, the kids, sponge holder, pal, minter, and grand vizier, drew him out to the bootblack stand at the saloon corner where all the official and important matters of the Small Hours Social Club were settled. As Tony polished the light tan shoes of the club's president and secretary for the 5th time that day, Burke spake words of wisdom to his chief. Cut that blonde out, kid, was his advice, or there'll be trouble. What do you want to throw down that girl of yours for? You'll never find one that'll freeze to you like Liz has. She's worth a haulful of Annies. I'm no Annie admirer, said the kid, dropping a cigarette ash on his polished toe and wiping it off on Tony's shoulder. But I want to teach Liz a lesson. She thinks I belong to her. She's been bragging that I daren't speak to another girl. Liz is all right in some ways. She's drinking a little too much lately, and she uses language that a lady oughtn't. You're engaged, ain't you? Asked Burke. Sure. We'll get married next year, maybe. I saw you make her drink her first glass of beer, said Burke. That was 2 years ago, when she used to came down to the corner of Christy Bear headed to meet you after supper. She was a quiet sort of a kid then, and couldn't speak without blushing. She's a little spitfire, sometimes now, said the kid. I hate jealousy. That's why I'm going to the dance with Annie. It'll teach her some sense. Well, you better look a little out, were Burke's last words. If Liz was my girl, and I was to sneak out to a dance coupled up with an Annie, I'd want a suit of chain armor on under my gladsome rags, all right? Through the land of the stork vulture wandered Liz. Her black eyes searched the passing crowds fierily but vaguely. Now and then she hummed bars of foolish little songs. Between times she set her small, white teeth together and spake crisp words that the East Side has added to language. Liz's skirt was green silk. Her waist was a large brown and pink plaid, well-fitting and not without style. She wore a cluster ring of huge imitation rubies and a locket that banged her knees at the bottom of a silver chain. Her shoes were run down over twisted high heels and were strangers to polish. Her hat would scarcely have passed into a flour barrel. The family in trance of the Blue Jay Cafe received her. At a table she sat and punched the button with the air of milady ringing for her carriage. The waiter came with his large-chinned, low-voiced manner of respectful familiarity. Liz smoothed her silken skirt with a satisfied wriggle. She made the most of it. Here she could order and be waited upon. It was all that her world offered her of the prerogative of woman. Whiskey, Tommy, she said as her sisters further uptown murmur. Champagne, James. Sure, Miss Lizzie. What'll the chaser be? Seltzer. And say, Tommy, has the kid been around today? Why, no, Miss Lizzie, I haven't saw him today. Fluently came the Miss Lizzie, for the kid was known to be one who required rigid upholdment of the dignity of his fiancée. I'm looking for him, said Liz, after the chaser had sputtered under her nose. It's got to me that he says he'll take Annie Carlson to the dance. Let him. The pink-eyed white rat. I'm looking for him. You know me, Tommy. 2 years me, and the kid's been engaged. Look at that ring. 500, he said it cost. Let him take her to the dance. What'll I do? I'll cut his heart out. Another whiskey, Tommy. I wouldn't listen to no such reports, Miss Lizzie, said the waiter smoothly, from the narrow opening above his chin. Kid Mullally not the guy to throw a lady like you down. Seltzer on the side? 2 years, repeated Liz, softening a little to sentiment under the magic of the distiller's art. I always used to play out on the street of evenings, 'cause there was nothing doing for me at home. For a long time, I just sat on doorsteps and looked at the lights and the people going by. And then the kid came along one evening and sized me up, and I was mashed on the spot for fair. The first drink he made me take, I cried all night at home, and got a licking for making a noise. And now say, Tommy, you ever see this Annie Carlson? If it wasn't for peroxide, the chloroform limit would have put her out long ago. Oh, I'm looking for him. You tell the kid if he comes in. Me? I'll cut his heart out. Leave it to me. Another whiskey, Tommy. A little unsteadily, but with watchful and brilliant eyes, Liz walked up the avenue. On the doorstep of a brick tenement, a curly-haired child sat, puzzling over the convolutions of a tangled string. Liz flopped down beside her, with a crooked, shifting smile on her flushed face. But her eyes had grown clear and artless of a sudden. "Let me show you how to make a cat's cradle, kid," she said, tucking her green silk skirt under her rusty shoes. And while they sat there, the lights were being turned on for the dance in the hall of the Small Hours Social Club. It was the bi-monthly dance, a dress affair in which the members took great pride and bestirred themselves huskily to further and adorn. At 9 o'clock the president, Kid Mullally, paced upon the floor with a lady on his arm. As the Lorleys was her hair golden. Her yes was softened to a yah, but its quality of assent was patent to the most Milesian ears. She stepped upon her own train and blushed, and she smiled into the eyes of Kid Mullally. And then, as the two stood in the middle of the waxed floor, the thing happened to prevent which many lamps are burning nightly in many studies and libraries. Out from the circle of spectators in the hall leaped Fate in a green silk skirt. Under the Liz. Her eyes were hard and blacker than jet. She did not scream or waver. Most unwomanly, she cried out one oath, the kid's own favorite oath, and in his own deep voice. And then while the Small Hours Social Club went frantically to pieces, she made good her boast to Tommy. The waiter made good as far as the length of her knife blade and the strength of her arm permitted. And next came the primal instinct of self-preservation, or was it self-annihilation? The instinct that society has grafted on the natural branch? Liz ran out and down the street swift and true as a woodcock flying through a grove of saplings at dusk. And then followed the big city's biggest shame, its most ancient and rotten surviving canker, its pollution and disgrace, its blight and perversion, its forever infamy and guilt, fostered, unreproved and cherished, handed down from a long ago century of the basest barbarity, the hue and cry. Nowhere but in the big cities does it survive, and here most of all, where the ultimate perfection of culture, citizenship, and alleged superiority joins, bawling, in the chase. They pursued a shrieking mob of fathers, mothers, lovers, and maidens howling, yelling, calling, whistling, crying for blood. Well may the wolf in the big city stand outside the door. Well may his heart, the gentler, falter at the siege. Knowing her way, and hungry for her surcease, she darted down the familiar ways until at last her feet struck the dull solidity of the rotting pier. And then it was but a few more panting steps, and good Mother East River took Liz to her bosom, soothed her muddily but quickly, and settled in 5 minutes the problem that keeps lights burning o' nights in thousands of pastorates and colleges. It's mighty funny what kind of dreams one has sometimes. Poets call them visions, but a vision is only a dream in blank verse. I dreamed the rest of this story. I thought I was in the next world. I don't know how I got there. I suppose I had been riding on the 9th Avenue elevated, or taking patent medicine, or trying to pull Jim Jeffries's nose, or doing some such little injudicious stunt. But, anyhow, there I was, and there was a great crowd of us outside the courtroom where the judgments were going on. And every now and then a very beautiful and imposing court officer angel would come outside the door and call another case. While I was considering my own worldly sins and wondering whether there would be any use of my trying to prove an alibi by claiming that I lived in New Jersey, the bailiff angel came to the door and sang out, "Case number 99,852,743. Up stepped a plainclothes man. There were lots of him there. dressed exactly like preachers and hustling us spirits around just like cops do on Earth, and by the arm he dragged whom, do you think? Why, Liz? The court officer took her inside and closed the door. I went up to Mr. Flykop and inquired about the case. A very sad one, says he, laying the points of his manicured fingers together. An utterly incorrigible girl. I am Special Terrestrial Officer the Reverend Jones. The case was assigned to me. The girl murdered her fiancé and committed suicide. She had no defense. My report to the court relates the facts in detail, all of which are substantiated by reliable witnesses. The wages of sin is death. Praise the Lord. The court officer opened the door and stepped out. Poor girl, said Special Terrestrial Officer the Reverend Jones, with a tear in his eye. It was one of the saddest cases that I ever met with. Of course she was. Discharged, said the court officer. Come here, Jonesy. First thing you know you'll be switched to the pot pie squad. How would you like to be on the missionary force in the South Sea Islands, hey? Now, you quit making these false arrests, or you'll be transferred C. The guilty party you've not to look for in this case is a red-haired, unshaven, untidy man, sitting by the window reading, in his stocking feet, while his children play in the streets. Get a move on you. Now, wasn't that a silly dream?